I'm Linden Showalter. My father was Roy, my mother Leona. My grandfather was Alva. And probably many of you who even know me don't know that my middle name carries my grandfather's first name. I grew up in a history family, and I didn't have a chance. I didn't have a chance to not like history, that is. For some, history is just dates and dull facts and dead people, but not so in the family I grew up in. My dad went out on history-finding adventures, and when he came back with nuggets, you'd have thought they were gold nuggets. History was exciting, it was valuable, it was relevant, it was alive. Like I said, I didn't have a chance. But I didn't take an active interest in my family history because I just assumed that Daddy had already fished the last one out. It would take years to learn everything he knew, let alone push forward into new frontiers. Besides, with 5 young children at home, I just didn't have the time. That all changed one day in 2010, and here's the story. I take each of my children on a trip out of the country when they graduate from high school. I took Anna, my oldest, to the Salzburg Music Festival in Austria. Austin, second. He's in the back, wave your hand, Austin. Austin and I rode bicycles from Amsterdam in the Netherlands to Copenhagen in Denmark. Those adventures could fill a whole evening, but we're not going there. Number 3, Gloria, asked for her trip if she could see castles and where our ancestors came from. Well, I assured her, they didn't come from the castles. But I'll see what I can do. On the 3rd night of our trip, we spent the night in a castle, in a youth hostel, overlooking the Rhine River. And we just loved the old buildings. We also saw the Traxelwald Castle in Switzerland, where some of our Anabaptist ancestors were imprisoned for their faith. We toured through another castle in the country of Luxembourg. These completely met the need for a castle experience, but what about where our ancestors came from? On the 10th day of our trip, we were driving to Showalter country, as I would call it, in southwest Germany. It says Deutschhof, you probably can't read the fine print, southwest of Frankfurt on the map of Germany. As we were driving toward Showalter country, I told Gloria that even though we have had amazing experiences every day of this trip so far, today has more dud potential than any other day of this whole trip. I have no personal contact here. I've made no lodging arrangements, though I tried. And I only have a vague idea of where to go and what to look for. We spent the morning at the Hafnerhof, a fascinating and old building where Showalters once rented and farmed. Showalters, not our direct ancestors, but related to them. There's a story of the Mennonites who lived at the Hafnerhof. In this journal, I found an article in German, got it translated into English. I have it published in a book. It's at one of the book tables, if you're interested in seeing more. The cover looks like this. Written by Paul Showalter. By afternoon, it was time to think about lodging, so we headed toward a nearby town with a youth hostel. Before reaching that town, I saw a road sign. It said Deutschhof, 1 kilometer, Kepler-Neuhof, 2 kilometers. So I made a quick turn to the right and told Gloria, my daughter, there's something in these little villages that we need to know about. I remember reading something, but I don't know what it is. We'll just drive through, we'll turn around, then we'll go back and we'll get our lodging arrangements for the evening. Deutschhof, the first village, had about a dozen homes plus a Mennonite church. We stopped at the church and got out to look around. The building was small but well cared for. Obviously, an active Mennonite congregation meets here. There's a cemetery around back. The cemetery had Showalters all over the place. At least a third, Gloria thought maybe 2/3 of the grave markers were Showalters. Well, I said, if the Showalters are dying in this village, I bet there's some that are living too. So we walked to the other end of the village. There was a delivery truck with Showalter written on the side. The driver was inside. He had his window turned down. When I talked to him, I found his name was Martin Showalter. Sound like any of your ancestors? He spoke English, but not so well. His wife, Uta, speaks better English. She went in, got a key to the church, and walked with us back to the church. Inside, I noticed a typed schedule of some sort, and I don't know if you can read that or not, but I happened to read the name Otto Showalter. I commented, and I said, it's real interesting, that name, because my dad had corresponded with a man with that same name. But I don't know where he lived, and I doubt that he's still living. He was my father's age, and my father is not still living. Uta said, well, we need to find out. She placed a cell phone call. There was this jabbery conversation in German that I wasn't following. And then she said, Otto is not home, but I just spoke to his wife, Bertie. She remembers of Otto writing to your father, and she wants to meet you. Otto will be home in about a half hour. They lived in the next village called Kaplaneihof. Now, when Otto came home, this is before he came home, his wife Bertie, son Christian, daughter Marlon, and son Timothy, I believe. Ruthie, you would know, you can correct me later if I'm wrong on that. When Otto came home, he was so surprised and pleased to meet the son of, in his words, Roy Moab Showalter. If there had been any doubt about him being the real Otto, the fact that he knew Daddy's middle name of Moab guaranteed that this Otto was the real deal. He gave us the Showalter history tour of the area. He took us across the border to France. First of all, I've got to get Otto's picture up. He took us across the border to France, where he showed us the Schafbusch. This is the house where, not the exact house, this is the farm where our immigrant ancestor Jacob was presumed to have been born, and the area where he moved from when he came to America. The Hagee family lives at the Schafbusch now. Back to Otto and Bertie's home, they insisted that we stay for supper, and for the evening, and for the night. It was Wednesday night, and we knew they had prayer meeting on Wednesday night. We had heard that in the afternoon. Otto is the minister of the church, and when I asked him about it, he said, oh no, we've canceled prayer meeting tonight. We'll pray next Wednesday. Daughter Inga came home from work, and she translated all evening for us. So I still don't know if they were more thrilled to meet us or if we were more thrilled to meet them. But it was we got such a welcome and such hospitality. So what about this was the day that had the most dud potential? Well, it turned out to be the highlight of our trip. And it opened up a friendship and a better understanding of our family's roots. Daddy set me up for this in ways that he couldn't have imagined. Now, the next year, I planned a trip to Germany and Switzerland for my brothers and sisters. And the year after that, I had another son, Grantley, graduate, and so I planned a trip with him. We went to some of the same places, and some other places as well. Grantley and I did a lot of hiking in the mountains. Grantley and I got our own personal tour of Strengelbach, Switzerland, by the village historian, Mr. Rudolf Hohl. On all of these trips, I have been blessed with such incredible experiences that I can only describe them as gifts from the German people, gifts from the Swiss people, and ultimately gifts from God. And I'm presenting this history tonight in order to pass on some of the gifts that I've been given. Before I go any further, I want to give credit to 6 individuals, 6 men, whose research and their work in history, I couldn't have a fraction of what I have without them. The first conversation of Showalters across the ocean, I believe, was between Preston and Paul Showalter. Later on, my father got involved in that conversation. When Paul became infirm and then died, my father picked up the conversation with Otto Showalter. Rudolf Holl is a historian in Strengelbach, Switzerland. I was introduced to him 2 years ago. And this symbol of Strengelbach symbolizes the book called The History of the Community of Strengelbach by Heinrich Fair, and I got a lot of information out of that as well. Now I'm going to back up a little bit. I'm going to start our family story at the time of Jesus. Colossians 3:11 says, "In Christ there is no Greek or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all." Our ancestors are named in this list of people types. They are, do you want to guess? They're not the Jews, not the Greeks, they're the barbarians. That barbarian is a big catch-all term, was at the time, for any people groups living outside the Roman Empire and presumably uncivilized. But which tribe of barbarians were they? Surprisingly, to me at least, they were not the Germanic tribespeople. They were Celtic tribespeople. This map in the light green shows the areas of Celtic settlement before the Germanic tribes moved in at around the time of Christ. Coincident with Germanic tribespeople moving in from the east and the push of the Roman Empire up from the south, the Celtic peoples were pushed into the northern and western fringes of Europe, as well as in the very center in the mountain areas. By the 6th century, though, the Helvetic Celts, the other continental Celts, had been absorbed into the dominant Germanic groups. Their Celtic culture, Celtic language, had completely ceased to exist. They weren't wiped out, they just got absorbed into the dominant culture, totally giving way to the Germanic languages and the Germanic cultures. So, again, surprisingly, our family line through the Showalter, the paternal line going back, is more closely connected genetically to the Welsh, the Irish, and the Scots than to the Germans. Now, in these centuries long ago, first names were all that were used. Surnames were adopted in Switzerland starting in the 1200s, and it wasn't until the 1500s that you see a lot of surnames showing up in written material. Some surnames were based on occupation. Some were on whose son you were. Some were on location. Showalter is one of these location names. This is a progression of our language, of our names, starting with how we spell it and working backwards. The Germans use an SCH. Take it back from Germany to Switzerland, and the T is a D, and you go back to the first time it appears, there's actually an N put in there, Showalter. What does our name mean? There have been several different meanings of our name proposed. There's 2 parts, the Show and the Walter. The Walter is the easy part. Wälder in German is one who lives at the Wald, or the forest. The Show part is harder because it could be any one of 3 words. Schon, meaning spared. Schön, with the 2 little dots above the O, meaning beautiful or lovely. And Schachen, or the floodplain. So to put the 2 parts together, a Schonwälder would be one who lived by the spared forest. That is, it was spared from cutting in order to save the resources of the forest for the wealthy people. A Schönwalder, the second one, would be one who lives by the beautiful forest, and a Schachenwalder would be one who lives on the forested floodplain. Each of the three meanings has some merit and some shortfall. I think that the first, the Schon, has more merit, and if you're interested in all of that, you can see me later. I'm not going to get into that here. So, in my opinion, a Schönwalder or Showalter is a person who lives by the forest that was spared from cutting in order to keep its resources for the wealthy people, but probably was settled on anyway illegally by the poor people who had nowhere else to go. That may have been our ancestors. Our written story starts in the year 1566. And I first want to show you the outline of generations that we're going to cover here, starting with Hans Schönwalder on the lower left, working clockwise around to Daniel. I don't know if you can see the dates and so forth. Observe the little flags that are by their names. That indicates what country or countries they lived in, each one. We're going to start with Hans Schönwalder. There's a question mark by his name because we're not sure if he's related or not to the rest. But from there on, it's a line of good historic connections. 1566, so how long ago was that? Well, do the math, it's about 450 years ago. That's kind of a long time. That falls somewhere between Christopher Columbus discovering the New World and the founding of Jamestown, the first English colony in the New World. 1566, William Shakespeare was a 2-year-old, toddling along the Avon River and babbling in baby English. The English language would never be the same once he grew up. Our dial is now going to point to Hans Schönwalder, 1566. We're in Switzerland. This is a picture from satellite. And if you see about in the middle of Europe, the white, that would be the white Alps Mountains. And just above that, in this little area here, is where we're going. Within Switzerland, we're talking about the northern part. I have another map there with the country names on it. And then a map of Switzerland. The northern part between the mountains, but not really in the mountains. We have the Alps Mountains taking up half the country to the south and east. We have the Jura up to the west and north. The Black Forest above that in the further north. This area is called the Mittelland, the Middle Land, or the Swiss Plateau. It's the hill and valley part of Switzerland. Right in the center of the German-speaking part of Switzerland. Right in the German-Swiss language, German-Swiss culture, we're going to a little village called Strengelbach, and you're going to hear that name quite a bit. In the year 1566, let's imagine that we're entering the village of Strengelbach, as these three Showalters did a few years ago, entering from the south. I wonder if this could be the Showalter homestead. I claimed it for us while we were there, only to find out later it was on the wrong end of town. But this is very typically Swiss. You have under one roof the house and the barn. And so I imagine knocking on the door of this house and asking if any Showalters live around here. Nope, we're told we're at the wrong end of the village. Hans Schönwalder, though, lives by the road to St. Ulrichs at the north end of the village. And today he happens to be paying his taxes, of all things. So let's just sort of imagine this scene. Now, if you're thinking about a Form 1040 and a W-2 and some 1099s, and at the evening mailing a tax return to the Swiss IRS, nah, not quite. It's not quite the right image. The written record tells us that, and here I quote from the oldest mention of a Showalter anywhere in the world. Oops, now I wasn't in the right place. In 1566, Hans Schönwalder of Strengelbach village paid a tax consisting of 18 bushels grain for his 7-acre field. This field lay between the Vicar River and the pastures. He also paid 8 bushels of grain for his 4-acre field. This field was across from Zofingen City's pond and next to the beautiful hillock called Schurenbuhl. Finally, he paid 3 silver coins for his own pond, which is between the forest and the road to Bern, just above the Schleife clearing. End of quote. This account of Hans Showalter and his tax is fascinating because it pinpoints, along with the help from this old map of Strengelbach, where Strengelbach is here, but south is on the top and north is at the bottom. I had to turn it upside down to make sense out of it. The fields were, again, across the river from Zofingen, city of Zofingen. Now I'm working backwards, that would be on this side. Between the Vicar River and the forest, the river coming through here, and the darker being the forest. Close to the road to Bern. The road to Bern, let me go upside down again, would be this. Here. We lay that upon a modern map. That map comes out of this particular book, History of the Community of Strengelbach. With a modern map, everything matches up. And so we know that in this area, probably within about 1/10 of a mile, this is a pretty small radius area, is where Hans Showalter was farming 450 years ago. I think that's pretty cool to zero in that close for that long ago. What else do we know about Hans Showalter? Basically nothing, except that we know plenty about the time and the place where he lived, thanks to Heinrich Fair. This picture that I put on the invitation was fascinating to me because it reminds me of Hans Showalter paying his tax in grain. This could almost be the Showalters, except that the Alps are a little too close. We have the Eiger, the Monk, and the Jungfrau right in the background. For Strengelbach, it would have actually been further away. I'm not sure you would have had quite a view like that. This is probably from the Emmental, or somewhere in that part of the canton of Bern. More pictures of Strengelbach and some current fields just slightly north of where Hans farmed. These modern houses are right on the farm development where his farm would have been. Picture of an old property being remodeled, some house and barn right in the middle of Strengelbach. The village of Strengelbach in 1566 consisted of 18 families. They farmed the surrounding fields. These level farm fields were mostly on the floodplain of this river, the Vicar River. Starting from the Alps Mountains about 30 miles in the south and flowing northward, the Vicar River frequently flooded in the spring from a combination of rain plus melting snow. Too much rain, too much flooding ruined the crops and made the soil hard, and too much time was spent on draining the fields and breaking up the hard soil. In this regard, Strengelbach stood in sharp contrast to its big sister neighbor, Zofingen. This drawing of Zofingen is from the 1500s. Zofingen and Strengelbach were separated by only about a mile or two and the Vicar River. For a local comparison, Zofingen, the city there, is to Strengelbach somewhat as Hagerstown is to Morgansville. I think you can relate to that. Zofingen, the city, like Hagerstown; Strengelbach, the village, like Morgansville. Zofingen settled first, Strengelbach later. Zofingen had the better location, the better land. Strengelbach was struggling on a floodplain. Zofingen had 2 walls, you can see them, and a moat for protection, while Strengelbach had neither a wall nor a moat. The people of Zofingen lived in relative security, while those in Strengelbach were vulnerable to the robbers that lived in the forests nearby. Even when the Vicar River was channelized, if you remember from the scene a little bit before, the Swiss people say the river was corrected. We say it was channelized. Strengelbach still remained a small village of economically challenged farm families. Both the city of Zofingen and the village of Strengelbach are significant in Showalter history. The Showalters lived and farmed in Strengelbach. They went to church in Zofingen. This is the same church where they would have gone to 450 years ago. Zofingen has a large ancient church. This was already an old church at that time. Its roots go back at least 1,000 years. Strengelbach was not a big enough village to have its own church. Originally, the Zofingen church was Catholic, but after the Reformation, it was Swiss Reformed, a church in the tradition of Ulrich Zwingli. And there are 7 Showalters on the doorstep of Zofingen Church. The gate across that didn't allow us to go in. For the residents of Strengelbach, the church in Zofingen was an easy walk, about a mile or 2. The Zofingen Church was the place for Sunday services, infant baptisms, and marriages. In the very decade following Hans and his tax, the Zofingen Church started to keep a baptism register and a marriage register. And so we looked to that for more clues of what our ancestors were doing. The Zofingen Church Baptism Register reports that in 1573, Sylvester Showalter and his first wife Barbelin, Strengelbach residents, had a child baptized at the Zofingen Church. This child was the first of 8 children of Sylvester's to be baptized there. Now, we don't know the relationship between Hans and Sylvester. That's why I have the line there and the question mark. They may have been father and son, but they may have been uncle and nephew. They may have been older brother, younger brother. May have been cousins or something else. That they were related is almost guaranteed certain, but how they were related, we're not sure. Over the next 150 or so years, a total of 78 Showalter infants were baptized in the Zofingen Church. The baptized children of Sylvester and his first wife, Barbelin Hunsinger, were, and I just like to say these names, so bear with me. They were Franny, Uli, Friedli, Casper, and Rudolph. If you're looking for some heirloom kind of names, you might want to look at that for your children or grandchildren. But then apparently Barbelin died, perhaps from the plague, perhaps from childbirth. Those were 2 big killers of women. Sylvester and his second wife, because he remarried, had 3 children, Madeline, Jacob, or in English, Jacob, and Vester, or short for his own name, Sylvester. Of the 2 wives and 3 children, our line comes through the second wife, Anna, and the middle child, Jacob. Out of the 78 infant baptisms, 3 are of most interest to us because these 3 are our direct ancestors. We have Jacob, who I just mentioned, son of Sylvester. We have Jacob II, son of Jacob I. We have Jacob III, son of Jacob II. All the rest of the 78 were their siblings, their brothers and sisters, and their cousins. Now, you just saw a bunch of Jacobs. Able to keep them all straight? Let me tell you, it doesn't get any easier. Of 78, 44 of them boys, 13, that's almost 1 in 3, had the name Jacob. So, if you were one of them, you probably had a dad, Jacob. You yourself were Jacob. You had a son, Jacob, eventually. You probably had cousins, Jacob. So that was not an easy thing. Second most common name for boys, Hans and Ulrich, the quintessentially Swiss name Ulrich. Out of the girls, common names were Anna, Barbara, and Elsbeth. Elsbeth, we would say in English, Elizabeth. We see the decades of how many Showalters were baptized. You can look at the numbers, I'm not going to read them, but just to point out that after a certain point they dwindled and then they stopped. The Showalters just disappeared from that part of the world. 2 years ago, and that was 1 year after my brothers and sisters visited, my son Grantley and I came back and attended a Sunday morning worship service at the Zofingen Reformed Church. We got there a little bit early, walked around inside, it was empty. The crowd didn't start coming until the church bells started ringing, and they rang for about 10 minutes solid. It was beautiful, actually. But in the meantime, I got a few photos from inside. That's the baptismal font. Our interest was especially piqued when Pastor Ruth Kramer announced that 3 children would be baptized during the service that morning. We tried to imagine the similarities between the service we witnessed and the ones from centuries ago when our Showalter ancestors were the infants being baptized. It was the same old church building. Certainly some of the liturgy was the same. As the children were baptized with the words, Ich taufe dir im Namen Vaters und Sohn und Heiliger Geist, I baptize you in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. After the service, Pastor Ruth and her husband, also Pastor Bernhard, introduced us to Rudolf Holl, and he's the one who devoted the rest of his day to us, showing us everything we could possibly want to know about the history of Zofingen and Strengelbach. Also recorded in the Zofingen church records were marriages. I have one more drawing of Zofingen. If you notice the spire in the very center, that's the church, 2 different roof lines. That's the church exactly how it is today. Now, since we're west-facing, Strengelbach would be maybe one of these places of settlement, or maybe the drawing was a little bit loose and you can't really know for sure. But also recorded in the church records were marriages. We know that Sylvester was married to Barbelin and then Anna. They were not in the marriage record because they were too early, but husband and wife were both named in the infant baptism records. But then we have Jakob I, married to one Anna and then another one. We have Jakob II, married to Margareta. Jakob III was married, but we don't know to whom because it's not registered. And you'll find out why a little bit later. But this Jakob III, we need to talk about him a little bit more. Before we do that, I want to go through our dial and ramp it up kind of quickly. All of these Sylvester, Jakob I, II, III, baptized at Zofingen, lived at Strengelbach. We get to the 3rd Jakob. And here we're going to take a little bit more time because he's a key figure in our history. He represents 2 major transitions: the conversion from Reformed Protestantism to Anabaptism. And he represents the immigration from Switzerland into the German Alsace region, which is in present-day France. As I mentioned, we don't know the name of his wife. Some have speculated that she might have been a Detweiler, since the Detweilers lived in Strengelbach alongside the Showalters. They also became Anabaptist about the same time, and they also moved to the same place in the Alsace. But that's not proof. The infant baptisms of Showalters become reduced, as we saw on the one slide, and after several more decades, the Showalters are no longer mentioned in either the baptism register or the marriage register at Zofingen. They just disappeared. And that would be the end of the story, except that at the very same time, not too surprisingly, I guess, they start popping up in a different part of the world, in the area right along the border between France and Germany. I don't have a map of that at this point, but I'll get to one. It's a distance of about 150 miles. That's a long distance for those days. Somebody could have almost driven here tonight 150 miles, though I'm not quite sure. And we'll talk about the trip north. Wonder if the Showalters left by their own choice, or were they forced to leave? Did they leave for religious reasons or economic reasons? And probably any combination of this is actually possible. Every generation has its challenges, but in Switzerland in the 1670s, it was an especially difficult time, especially difficult decade. Areas of instability included demographics, climate, agriculture, economics, politics, social unrest, religion. Is there anything else in a community's life that wasn't in turmoil at that time? The 30 Years' War was over. That was a good thing. The Swiss had not been in the war, which was mostly a French versus German conflict, but the Swiss farmers had strong markets during the war. And now that the war's over, the markets evaporated and the prices of farm products plunged. There were sudden and unexplainable climate changes. They'd have a few good growing seasons, followed by cold years, where the growing seasons were not long enough to harvest a decent crop. There's records that May and September were not growing months, and from June to August was barely long enough to get in much of a crop. Crop failure meant famine, and famine meant starvation. On top of that, the powerful city people manipulated the currency, the Bernese batzen, to their benefit and to the detriment of the farmers. Then the plague would come through, which even in small communities like Zofing and Stringelbach could take 100 lives in a single year, and then come back a few years later and do its deadly deed all over again. The peasants revolted. The peasants had many grievances against their rulers. One grievance was an unfair tax structure, which taxed all of a person's property, but didn't allow for their debts. This tax season was hard on the peasants or the farmers who may have owned a large property, but usually also had a large mortgage or debt on the property and didn't have much net worth. They still had to pay taxes as high as the wealthy people. There was a common understanding that these problems, especially the climate and the plague, were from God's punishing hand. Though, as one historian says, the misdemeanor was unclear. On the one hand, the rulers scapegoated the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists, the rulers said, had incited God's vengeful hand through their disrespect of the state church. And to make matters worse, the Anabaptists were increasing in number almost daily. That's the ruler's perspective. On the other hand, the rural population had an entirely different interpretation about God's punishing hand. To the rural people, God's punishment stemmed from the fact of how the authorities were mistreating God's people. And to the rural people, it was easy to identify God's people, just observe how they lived their lives. The horrible 1670s were followed by a good and easy, comfortable 1680s. Complacency set in. Lots of births, lots of mouths to feed. It turned out to be a bad setup for the following decade, the 1690s, which were just as bad or even worse than the 1670s. Hard times caused people to ask hard questions and to look for spiritual answers to their hard questions. Questions like, what is real? What is truth? What am I willing to live for? What am I willing to die for? And am I ready to die? How can I be certain of my salvation? What would God have me to do? For some, the answers to these questions were found in the faith of the Anabaptists. A compelling witness was also seen in the exemplary moral lives of many of the Anabaptists. And so, Jacob III embraced the faith of the Anabaptists. He asked for and received a second baptism. He had been baptized as an infant, as we've seen. This time he took an adult believer's baptism. The third Jacob and his family joined a group called, in German, the Wiedertäufer. We call them the Anabaptists, later to be known as Mennonites. The Anabaptists began in 1525, in the early years of the Protestant Reformation, in the city of Zurich. They formed a Christian fellowship based on voluntary membership, completely independent of state church control. They baptized upon confession of faith, rejected infant baptism. They stressed living in obedience to God's word. They rejected violence in all its forms, including military participation. Now, both the government and the church felt threatened by this movement, since it disrupted 1,000 years of tight connections between the government, the church, and the population. At first, the powers dealt with this Anabaptist threat by offering debates. They believed we can convince them of the error of their ways. Debates between the Reformed leaders and the Anabaptists. One of the first of these debates took place, at all places, in Zofingen, kind of a small town to hold something that momentous, and yet it was kind of neutral territory, and it had the advantage of being almost halfway between the big cities of Zurich and Bern. I wonder if Hans Showalter was aware of the debate. Perhaps, but in the least, he would have been aware of the debate. He would have been aware of the issues involved. Now, at the end of the debate, the Reformed theologians were always declared to be the winners, even when many times the common people were certain that the Anabaptist leaders and teachers had presented a more convincing case. But if you declared yourself sympathetic to the Anabaptist, or even went all the way and received the baptism, that was a dangerous move. It would invite persecution, possibly to the point of death. The story of the Anabaptists from their start in 1525 through the late 1600s is a progression from evangelism and rapid growth, followed by severe persecution, and then on to tenuous survival. By the late 1600s again, and think about it in generations, this would be about 5 generations after Conrad Grebel and Felix Manz, the Anabaptists had been totally eradicated from the Swiss regions of Zurich and Schaffhausen by a combination of imprisonments, beheadings, drownings, and banishments. In the region of Bern, however, the persecution was just as intense, but the result was different. The Anabaptist movement survived in the Bernese regions, especially in the remote Oberland and Emmental valleys. In fact, in this time period, Bernese Anabaptism experienced a period of renewal and growth. It's been reported that more family names were added during this time period that have continued to the present time than any other period of Anabaptist or Mennonite history. And so the Showalters were part of a large movement to Anabaptism at this particular place and at this particular time. The third Jakob joined the Anabaptists. Southwest Germany and northeast France had experienced near total devastation from the 30 Years' War. Decades later, large areas were still only sparsely populated and were not fully productive. Numerous estate owners sought out the Swiss Anabaptists to settle on their estates, since they had a reputation for being successful farmers, hardworking, and honest. But even a good reputation was not enough to gain the Anabaptists full rights in these German and French regions. They were allowed only to rent land and not own it. They were allowed to gather in groups of 20 or less. We would be illegal. They were not supposed to evangelize, not even their own children, though they did it anyway. They also had an obligation to pay taxes that others did not have to pay. So having escaped from severe persecution in Switzerland, the level of toleration for Anabaptists in France and Germany was only a little better, and even then it was carried out inconsistently. Nevertheless, a high-ranking government official made a ruling, and in it he stated the following: they, the Anabaptists, cleaned the land, put it back into productivity by clearing off the wild-growing brush. These people do not bother or hinder anyone, but live very peaceably. Getting ready to say goodbye to Stringelbach, one other more old house. In the center is the Swiss flag, the canton, Aargau, the village, Stringelbach. Each has its own flag. And one more entrance or exit to the city, and down the Rhine River. We are still at Jakob III, who joined the Anabaptists and left Switzerland. In the church records in Steinsalz in the Alsace, we find the Showalters living at a place called the Schafbusch. It is right on the northwest corner of France, It was many times over the history in German control, and it's more of a German language, German culture part of France. Church records in Alsace state that in April of 1731, Jakob Showalter died at the Schafbusch. That is a picture of the Schafbusch. At the age of 85, modern picture of the Schafbusch. A story has been written about the Hagi family who lived in the 1900s at the Schafbusch. Hans Hagi, who grew up there, talking to Otto Showalter and some American Showalters. An old trough, which is now in flowers, dates from medieval times as evidenced by this signal here, this symbol, which is from the Teutonic Knights of the Middle Ages. Another picture of Schafbusch before we leave it. Jakob III joined the Anabaptists, left Switzerland, and settled at the Schafbusch. Also died at the Schafbusch. That's what we're reading. This record states that Jakob was a native of Strengelbach in the canton of Bern. Now this is a remarkable piece of evidence from those times, since very seldom was a precise location for an immigrant, that is, canton and village, attached to their name. But this record raises two problems. Here it is. In April 1731, Jakob Showalter died at the Schafbusch at the age of 85. He was a native of Strengelbach in the canton of Bern. I have two problems with that. Problem number one, Strengelbach is not in the canton of Bern. It is in the canton Aargau. Okay, something's wrong. And problem number two, the math doesn't work. Here's the math problem. If Jakob died in 1731 at the age of 85, 1731 minus 85 equals 1648. We go look at Zofingen at the baptismal records. We don't find anybody born or baptized named Jakob in 1648. We do find somebody 46. We do find 1648, off by 2 years. So maybe this isn't the same person. Well, we have two problems, but we have two solutions. So we do make the connection back. Solution one, Canton Aargau was formed in the early 1800s. That part of the territory previously was in Canton Bern, so there's no inconsistency by saying Strengelbach and Canton Bern. And solution number two, people more expert than me who would say a difference of 2 years, no consequence. They say this is the same Jakob. No question at all. So the Jakob who we saw baptized at Zofingen earlier in Switzerland is the same Jakob who died at Schafbusch in the Alsace, present-day France, German territory, over the years. The date of immigration, we don't know, just as the decade or even the time converted to the Anabaptists, we don't know. This region of Alsace is located near a larger town of Wissembourg, very close to the border, as we've seen. It was considered a German area until relatively recently. And what has happened to it over the years is it's like a ping pong ball. Every generation, there's a new war, there's a new winner, and Alsace goes to the other side, just back and forth, back and forth. The last war between Germany and France was, anybody want to say what the last war was? World War II, yep. And who won, Germany or France? France was on the winning side, Germany the loser. So guess where Alsace is today? France. Okay, today Alsace is French. Again, a picture of the Schafbusch. The Showalters settled at the Schafbusch, and they formed the center of a Mennonite congregation there, along with the families of Müller, Burkholder, Weber, Schmidt, and Kramer. Worship services were held in this very home, in a room called the Kirchenstube, or the church room. Later, the meetings were held on a rotating basis on other farms where Anabaptists or Mennonites lived, but this was still the center, and communion services were held here. Then later on, way into the 1800s, the farm was sold to non-Mennonite owners, and the meeting center was shifted nearby, just a half mile, to Geisberg. Today, a thriving Mennonite congregation continues to worship at Geisberg. This is the continuation of the same congregation, actually founded by Linden Showalter, who left Switzerland. The Showalter family tour group of 2011 attended a worship service at the Geisberg Mennonite Church. The service was entirely in French. The sermon was in French. As you can see, we heard a sermon about Ephesians chapter 3, though we didn't understand a word of it. But it was interesting to be there. The only thing that was not in French, for reflecting the taste of the older people, they sang several of their hymns in German. Because just a generation ago, they would have been doing everything in German. And the older folks still like to hear the German hymns. Picture again of the Geisberg Church. Okay, we move on to Jakob III's son, Ulrich. Now we get kind of sketchy details, and we kind of have to fill in some gaps. Clues tell us that Jakob III had at least two children, Ulrich and another Jakob. And surprisingly this time, we don't come through Jakob, we come through Ulrich. And this Ulrich was the father of Hans, Jakob V, and Christian. Hans settled at Geisberg, and his descendants are across the border in Germany. And this is the interior of the Deutschhof Mennonite Church. You saw that when Gloria and I were on our adventure and met up with Otto. Otto explaining some Showalter history, I'm sure. History of the Showalter family. Here's a family reunion of German Showalters and American. I'll just point out my own brothers and sisters. Some of you probably know them. My oldest brother, Donald. My older sister, Ruby. Helen. Carolyn. Lowell. I'm in the back with my wife, Ruthie. And my youngest sister, Beverly. And Jean is Don's wife. So Hans settled at Geisberg. His descendants went to the Deutschhof. Two of the pastors are Showalter. Otto on the right and Gunther Showalter on the left. Hans's two brothers, Christian and Jakob V, immigrated to America, and Jakob V, I will call him the rest of the way, if I can keep my words straight, Jacob, because he settled in English-speaking territory, and I will call him Jacob the immigrant. He is the common ancestor of most Showalters in America today. All three of the sons became ministers. Christian, the middle one, surprisingly, was an Amish minister. Jacob the immigrant. We know from official court records at Wissembourg where Jacob was living in 1748, just 3 years before immigration. We know where he lived in March, the year of immigration, because legal complaints were brought against him in the court. Now, the legal complaints aren't real detailed, but here's the typical scenario at the time. The native Alsatian tenant farmers were resentful of the Swiss intruders, and Jacob the immigrant, though he was born in the Alsace, was considered a Swiss immigrant because that's where his grandfather came from. The Swiss immigrants, through their resourcefulness and hard work, could afford to pay higher rents than many of their native neighbors. And this was the case even though the Anabaptists had 2 extra taxes to pay. One tax for not belonging to the state church, and a second tax for military exemption. So, over time, the level of rents tended to rise for everyone. Now, the owners of the estates loved that. They liked being able to charge higher rents. But the native Alsatian farmers resented the immigrants for that reason. And they looked for ways to block them from getting leases to the local farms. So 2 times in 3 years, a complaint was brought against Jacob. And some of the reasons that they often gave were, they're the wrong religion for this area. Or, they raise too much of a certain crop and it drives down the prices. Or, they use too much of a particular resource. So Jacob's neighbors were trying all sorts of tactics to block him from getting farm leases. In this German or German-French area, the immigration of the Swiss settlers into it, plus a high birth rate among the immigrants, solved the problem, the older problem of too few people to farm the land. But now they had a new problem. After only about a generation or 2, it was difficult to find farms to rent. And the father was expected to find the farms for his sons. Now, that was a challenge for anyone, but the more sons one had, the more farms one had to find, and the harder the job. Jacob Showalter, the immigrant, had an especially big job on his hands because he and his wife Maria had 11 children. 8 of them were sons, 3 were daughters. He had to find farms for all 8 of his sons. And I guess if he was successful with that, he would have wanted to try to find farms for his sons-in-law as well. So he had too many children for too few available farms. So the year 1750, Jacob and Maria and their entire family had it with the problems in Europe, the religious discrimination, the high taxes, the legal hassles, the economic pressures, so they left for the New World. They traveled down the Rhine River with a neighbor family, the Boslers, who were also from Schaffbusch and were also Anabaptists. When they got to the Netherlands, they boarded an English ship, a Quaker-owned ship called Brotherhood. John Thompson was the captain of the ship. They left Rotterdam, took a course by way of the Isle of Wight. The trip probably took 6 to 12 weeks. Jacob and Daniel immigrated to America. On November 3, 1750, today is November 3, the English ship Brotherhood arrived in Philadelphia with 300 passengers, including the entire Jacob Showalter family, adult sons included, the entire Jacob Bosler family. I point out in highlight Jacob and Maria, the parents, all of their children, approximate ages. We come through the line of Daniel. We also come through the line of Barbara. We have 2 children of Jacob and Maria's that were descended through. Barbara married Henry Funk. They moved to Virginia. Ancestors of the Funks of Singer's Glen. Also ancestors of Elizabeth Shank, who in the 1800s married Michael Showalter. So that's how we're connected to Barbara as well as Daniel. Now, for about half the crowd, if you are from the Amos family, how many here are from the Amos family? Okay, pretty good showing there. And if you are from the Alva family, okay, you also have connections through the Boslers who accompanied the Showalters on the ship. And here's how that works. Jacob and Veronica had 3 sons, one of them Joseph. Eventually had descendants among the Leschers. The Leschers connect through the Groves and the Shanks. 2 sisters, Rhoda Shank and Katie Shank, married Showalter brothers Amos and Alva. Sisters married brothers. But that's how about 2/3 of the crowd here tonight ties in with the Bosler family as well. They left from the same place. They traveled the ship together. They settled in the same place. They were friends. They were families that got along well. So we got our families to America. What did they do when they got to America? First thing, they filed past probably the courthouse. This is page 14 in the ship record. some ancestors signing their name on this page. There were 3 pages downstairs. I don't know if it's been brought up or not, but I have the copies of the 3 pages of the people who signed from the Ship Brotherhood. In the left-hand column, zoom in a little bit, I'm going to point out the big signature, Jacob Showalter. Now, don't ask me how to make an SCH out of that, but just trust me that it does. And I think you can probably see from there, it goes W, I don't know what that might be, A-L-D-E-R, but that says Jacob Showalter. To go back, under Jacob, his son Jacob, Johannes or John, Joseph, Christian, and Peter. Above them, a little bit harder to make out, but trust me because it is, Jacob Bossler and his sons, Peter, I think, Jacob, and I forget, but those are the Bosslers. So they not only traveled together, they walked through the courthouse together. Okay, Jacob. Okay. Don't know why that slide looks like that, but we got our dial of generations around to Jacob and Daniel. We're going to let them on the dock, or I should say in the courthouse in Philadelphia, because if we kept going, we would be here till probably midnight. We don't want to do that. We can save up the rest for part 2. There is no planned part 2, but I almost think that there ought to be at some point. If there is a part 2, we will follow the story in America following the 1750 immigration. Jacob the immigrant, Daniel, his 12-year-old son on the ship, down through Joseph, Daniel, Michael, Moab. Now we're into familiar territory. Put your grandfather there, and so forth. But that would be part 2. What I'm going to give you is just a sneak preview of part 2. This is the Lehigh River, and Jacob settled following his November arrival. The next spring, he bought land along the Lehigh River, right about right here. On that spot, there's a cement factory today. Too bad. Jacob was buried in this cemetery called the Old Mennonite Cemetery, or the Siegfried Cemetery. John Siegfried was from the Mennonite congregation, growing up at least, but he became involved in the Revolutionary War. He didn't remain in the Mennonite church. The Mennonite church, eventually people moved out and the building was abandoned, but the cemetery remains due to John Siegfried, who fought in the Revolutionary War. The Showalter family had to stay inside there in the 1960s or so. And if you're interested in reading about the Mennonite settlement along the Lehigh River, there's a section of it in this book, The Life and Times of Colonel John Siegfried, and I have copies of this available. Daniel moved from the Lehigh River area to Chester County and settled in what is now a village called Devon, very wealthy part of Chester County, and his farm was somewhere along the Lincoln Highway. Could have been either side of this. He moved from there to a farm west of Broadway, Virginia. I guess many of you have seen this picture, some at least have. This is the farm when Daniel's, how many generations later, about 4 or so, descendant Moab sold the farm in a hurry and went north to Washington County. Now maybe you know the rest of the story. And this is what that same farm looks like that I would call the Showalter homestead. It's not in Showalter ownership today. Daniel, again the immigrant who was born in Alsace, came as a 12-year-old on the ship, buried in the cemetery at Tristle's Mennonite Church at Broadway, Virginia, and this is his grave marker. And again, we'll let it go at that. But I promised in the letter, the invitation letter, that I would answer a bonus question. The bonus question is, are we related to Buck Showalter? Now, in case you don't pay any attention to professional sports, that's okay. Buck Showalter is the manager of the Baltimore Orioles, a Major League Baseball team. Previously to this assignment, Buck had managed for the New York Yankees and the Arizona Diamondbacks and the Texas Rangers. For each of these teams, Buck had taken a young or mediocre team and turned them into contenders within a few years. But he usually got in trouble with the owners of the teams because he's kind of a big personality with a little bit of an attitude perhaps at times, I don't know. By 2010, the Orioles were growing weary of their losing streaks, and they were desperately looking for a manager who could turn the team around. On August 2nd, the Orioles announced the hiring of Buck Showalter as their manager, and what followed was, again, a remarkable turnaround, from last place teams to first place teams. One sports announcer even dubbed this team the Fighting Showalters. And as a committed non-resistant, I do get kind of a kick out of the irony in that term. In the baseball year just ended, Buck led the Orioles to just one level short of the World Series. For his leadership, Buck Showalter will probably be named as American League Manager of the Year, and watch for an announcement next week. Tell him you heard it here first. By the way, Buck Showalter was invited to this presentation. I'm not sure if he turned up or not. Is Buck here? I didn't think so. But the question still was, is he related to us? So the story keeps going. Growing up in Maryland in the 1960s and 70s, my favorite sports team was the Baltimore Orioles. They were the home state team, and besides, they were one of the best teams of that era. Anyone paying any attention to baseball during those times knows the names of Brooks Robinson, Frank Robinson, Boog Powell, and Jim Palmer. Many of my cousins also liked the Orioles. So following the managerial announcement, my cousins started asking me, are we related to him? Now, my workload at the office was a little bit light at the time, so I started an investigation on the internet. I got my first break when I discovered that Buck's given name was William Nathaniel Showalter. Okay, that's a clue. But then I found out it was not only that, but it is William Nathaniel Showalter III. Now, as a genealogist, I've got a few clues. I know his dad's name and I know his granddad's name. So I did some search on William Nathaniel, and I came to a genealogy site that the person claimed to be a granddaughter of William Nathaniel Showalter. Her name is Kathy Showalter Dalton. I wrote to her through email, and she wrote back and confirmed that she is a first cousin to Buck Showalter. Now, since she had her lineup from Jacob down through, and then she went a different direction, but I knew the rest of Buck's lineup, and we started Jacob, so I put my lineup along this side. I found that I am Buck's sixth cousin once removed. So if you know what you are to me, you can put your stuff in there and see how you're related to Buck Showalter. Again, we leave at Daniel. And if you have any more questions, or if you want to read the text of this presentation tonight, you can go to www.showalterhistory.com. This website has been in existence for about 10 hours. There's not much on it, but there is the entire text of the presentation tonight, and a little bit besides, and there will be more added to this over time. Now, I'm going to give the crowd, you've been really patient and long-suffering, I guess, and interested, I hope, but I'm going to give you a chance for maybe, say, 2 or 3 questions if something you wanted clarification, anything that you might want to know. I'll take a question from the group. Yes?
Is that name of the Bosslers, is that the Bosslers in Virginia? Bossler.
The question is the Bossler that we showed that we were related to came on the same ship? Are they the same as the Bosslers in Virginia? And unfortunately, I don't know. I've not done work on that family line, other than I know that at least the one branch connects into Franklin County through the Leshers, Groves, and Shanks. Any others? Okay?
If you're being charged for all this information, how much would it be?
If I would be charging for all this information, how much would it be? Well, I'm going to go back to when Daddy came home with nuggets. They were as valuable as gold to him, so I don't think there would be a price tag that could go on that. Maybe one or two more.
How old is Otto that you met?
How old is Otto Showalter in Germany? He is in, I believe, maybe one of my brothers and sisters can help me if I'm wrong, but I would say he's in his early 70s. Does that sound right? They're consulting. They don't know either for sure, but I would say early 70s.
How did your dad meet up with Otto? How did they connect?
How did my dad connect to Otto? Of course, they never met in person.
Right.
They met through correspondence. Well, it started with Preston corresponding with Paul, and I don't know how that started between Preston and Paul. But then my dad got in on the communication with Paul up through about 1980. Then Paul developed an incapacitating mental illness. He was living, but he was hospitalized. He could not correspond any longer, and he died in 1984. Following that, my dad wrote to the Mennonite History Center in the Weierhof, Germany, and he said, is there anyone else I could correspond to who knows about Showalter history? And the director, I guess, there said, you need to talk to Otto Showalter. So Daddy started typing out letters. My brothers and sisters can probably picture this, typing out letters on his typewriter. He would mail them. They would go to Otto, who was a farmer, minister, but full-time farmer, who couldn't read English, and he would take them to get translated. And then when he would find time, he would write out by hand with pen and paper, and he would write a letter back in German. And Daddy would get the letter, and he would eventually get it to a translator. He would eventually find out what it read in English, and then he would, so they went back and forth. Very tedious process. But there were a number of letters between them, to the point that, yes, Otto just, you know, he knew of my father as if he was a friend. Okay, one more perhaps. Okay, if not, that's fine, and I'll be around if anybody wants to ask me any other questions later. Won't always have the answers, but I'll try. I'll do what I can. Just wanted to say, again, I kind of alluded to the fact that this might end up being part one of a part two series. I have papers on one of the tables back in the lobby. If you are interested in knowing if there's any more events that come around, such as a part two, such as possibly a tour of Showalter sites in Washington County, or Rockingham County, Virginia, or even if you're interested in a tour of Strengelbach, Zofingen, Schaffbusch, and Geisberg. Put your level of interest on that sheet, because we'll see where this leads to.
Linden, would it be possible to have the different families stand up? I don't even know where some of these fit in at, and I want to be sure they're all Showalter.
Maybe we should start by saying, if you're not a Showalter, let's do you first. Stand up if you're not or not married to one. If you're married, you're in. Marriage gets you in. But some are here just for the interest of it. So, yeah, you know, there's a number here. They wanted to come just for the history of it. Thank you. Now, I'm going to start, and I might need Ruthie's help for this. Ruthie, where are you? Okay. The oldest of Moab and Anna's children was Amanda, married to a bear. If you are from the Amanda branch, would you stand up? And again, if you're married, it counts. Marriage gets you in. Okay? Got a number? And next in line is Alpha, so I'm standing. I even got the name. I have to stand. Okay? So these are my cousins. And related to the cousins. Next is, Ruthie, help me, is it Amos?
Yes.
Amos. If you're from Amos, Amos had the largest family, and that speaks for itself right here. Good. Okay. Now, Bertie was next. I'm just going to ask, does anybody remember Aunt Bertie? Yeah. Okay. So if we remember her, Aunt Bertie did not have children, and she married Lloyd Bowers. I remember visiting her. Daddy spoke fondly of Aunt Bertie. And then next is
Emma.
Emma. Emma's married name was Evie. If you're from Emma's branch of the family, do we have anyone? And who was after Emma? Martin. I know there's a lot. Uncle Mart. Okay, another large group here. And then Minnie Hostetter. Okay, we have some Hostetters. Or related to the Hostetters. Good. And then? Irvin Frank. And I didn't know any of his descendants. I didn't know who to send invitations to for his connection. So any Irvin Frank, I didn't think there would be. Okay. All right, that brings us to the end of our evening. Again, thank you for your attention. So glad to see such interest in our family history. It's really fun to be here and to meet everybody and to make this presentation. I hope you were blessed and educated about your family and where you've come from. And with that, go with God's blessing and God's peace.